She had 54 years. Not the long, comfortable retirement of a legend who watches the sport move forward without her. Not the decades of reflection that most champions are given to sit with what they built and what it cost. 54 years that began in a house in Clarksville, Tennessee with 21 siblings and a leg that doctors had already written off, and ended in 1994, that had been sitting inside her for decades. Something about a woman she had never forgiven. Something the sport had never fully heard. The revelations did not come in a single moment. They came the way truth usually comes from people who have spent years choosing their words carefully. In pieces. Across interviews. Across her 1,977 autobiography. Across the quiet conversations that journalists sometimes captured and sometimes missed in the end. Directed at a system, and at one comparison in particular, that communicate to people who have not lived inside it, not struggling, not making do. Poor in the structural, daily, generational sense where the absence of resources shapes every decision and every possibility before a child is old enough to understand what possibilities are. Wilma was premature. She weighed 4.5 pounds at birth and spent her earliest weeks in a condition that gave her family little reason for certainty. What followed in her childhood was a series of illnesses that would have defined a lesser story entirely. Scarlet fever, pneumonia, and then, at 4 years old, polio. The diagnosis arrived with a prognosis attached that the family absorbed in the way families absorb news they cannot change. The left leg was affected. The doctor said she would not walk normally. One doctor said she would not walk at all. Her mother responded in the only way available to her. She gathered her children, explained the situation, and organized a rotation. Every day, multiple times a day, one of Wilma's siblings would massage her affected leg. The treatment was not medical in the formal sense. It was love applied with consistency and stubbornness and a complete refusal to accept the ceiling the diagnosis had placed on her daughter's future. It worked. Slowly, then faster, then completely. By 9 years old, Wilma had discarded the brace. By 13, she was playing basketball. By 15, she had been discovered by Tennessee State University track coach Ed Temple, who saw something in her movement that the medical history made almost impossible to explain and decided to build around it anyway. Under Temple, she became a Tiger Bell, part of the Tennessee State women's track program that would produce more Olympic athletes than almost any institution in the country. She was 16 when she ran at the 1,956 Melbourne Olympics, young enough that the experience was more education than expectation. By the time Rome arrived 4 years later, the education was complete. What remained was the performance. Rome, 1960. The stadium was full and the night was warm, and 80,000 people had come to watch history without knowing that was what they were watching. A 20-year-old woman from Clarksville, Tennessee, stood at the starting line of the 100-meter final and did something nobody in that stadium had seen before. She won. Then she came back and won again. Then she came back one final time and won the relay, and the crowd, which had not expected any of this, responded in the only way that felt adequate. They called her the fastest woman alive. They called her a goddess. The Italian press gave her a name that translated to something close to Black Gazelle. She accepted none of the names. She already had one. 3 gold medals, 100 meters, 200 meters, 4 by 100 relay. Each one won in a way that made the margin feel larger than the time suggested. Each one accompanied by a reaction from the Italian crowd that went beyond sports appreciation into something closer to genuine awe. The American media arrived home with her and constructed the story the way American media constructed stories about athletes in 1960. The triumph over adversity. The girl from Tennessee who should not have walked and had instead become the fastest woman in the world. The polio survivor standing on the Olympic podium 3 times. It was a story that wrote itself, and it was written extensively, and for a period of time, Wilma Rudolph was the most celebrated female athlete in the country. But celebrity in sport does not exist without comparison, and comparison in 1960 meant one name above all others. Babe Didrikson Saharias. Mildred Ella Didrikson, who the world knew as Babe, had been the dominant female athlete in America for 3 decades before Wilma Rudolph ever set foot on an Olympic track. She had won gold medals at the 1,932 Los Angeles Olympics in the javelin and hurdles. She had become one of the greatest golfers in the history of the women's game. She had been voted the greatest female athlete of the first half of the 20th century by the Associated Press. She was, by any honest measure, a legitimate giant of American sport whose achievements deserved every word of recognition they received. Babe had died in 1956. She was not alive when Wilma ran in Rome. She could not speak for herself, could not clarify, could not extend or withhold anything directly. But the people around her legacy could, and they did. The comparison began almost immediately after Rome. Journalists and commentators who had built careers around the Babe Didrikson story began positioning Wilma's achievements in relation to that legacy in a way that Wilma found deeply and permanently offensive. Not the comparison itself. Comparison in sport is inevitable and often fair. What offended her was the framing. The suggestion, never stated directly but always present in the construction of the sentences, that Wilma's 3 gold medals existed in a lesser category. That the competition she had faced in Rome was not the competition Babe had faced in Los Angeles. That the era was different, the field was weaker, the achievement was impressive but not quite equivalent to what had come before. Wilma heard every version of this argument. She heard it in interviews. She heard it in the commentary that accompanied her victories. She heard it in the spaces between sentences, where the implication lived more comfortably than it could have survived as a direct statement. And what she felt in response was not the frustration of competitive ego. It was something more specific and more justified. She had survived polio. She had grown up in poverty in the segregated South, in a state and a city where the systems surrounding her had been constructed to limit exactly what she was becoming. She had reached a city that operated with a fraction of the resources available to comparable programs. She had won 3 gold medals against the best female sprinters in the world from every nation in the most watched athletic competition on the planet. And the response from certain corners of the American sporting establishment was to suggest that Babe had done it first, and done it in a way that remained the standard. Wilma Rudolph did not accept this. She spoke about it carefully in the years that followed, in the measured way that public figures of her era, particularly black women in America, learned to speak about grievances that the culture was not fully prepared to hear directly. But the feeling beneath the careful language was never careful. It was sharp and permanent and never fully dissolved, regardless of how many awards she received or how many times her story was told in the decades that followed Rome. She felt that the comparison was not really about athletic achievement. It was about whose achievement the establishment was most comfortable celebrating. That the machinery which had decided Babe was the standard had also decided, without examining the evidence fairly, that the standard would not be moved by a black woman from Clarksville, Tennessee, regardless of what she ran or how many times. She won. That was what she never forgave. Not Babe herself, who had no part in what was done with her legacy after her death, but the system that used that legacy as a ceiling rather than a foundation. The people who decided that comparison meant hierarchy rather than appreciation. The establishment that had extended every grace to one generation and withheld it from the next without ever honestly examining why. Wilma Rudolph retired from competition in 1962 at 22 years old. She said at the time that she wanted to leave at the top, wanted the final image to be Rome rather than a slower version of Rome. That was the public explanation, and it was true as far as it went. What was also true was that the world she had returned to after Rome was not the world her achievement deserved. Clarksville held a parade in her honor. She requested that it be integrated, that the parade welcoming her home not be divided along the lines that divided everything else in that city, in that era. The city agreed. It was the first integrated public event in Clarksville's history. She had to fight for it. She had to use her celebrity as leverage to obtain a basic decency that should not have required leverage. That was the context in which the comparison to Babe Didrikson landed. Not in a vacuum where athletic achievement existed separately from everything surrounding it, but in an America where a woman who had just become the most decorated female track athlete in Olympic history had to negotiate the terms of her own homecoming parade. She carried the resentment quietly because quiet was the only register available to her. She built a foundation for underprivileged youth. She spoke at schools. She told her story in the way it needed to be told, because she understood that the story had value beyond her own experience. But she never stopped knowing what had been withheld. Never stopped understanding that the grace extended so freely to one generation had required her to fight for every inch of it. Wilma Rudolph died on the 12th of November, 1994. She was 54 years old. The brain tumor had been diagnosed that same year, and in the months between diagnosis and death, she did what she had always done. She kept moving. She kept speaking. She kept showing up in the way that a woman who had been told at 4 years old that she would never walk had learned to show up, without apology, without drama, without asking the world to make space for her, because she had long since understood that space was something you created for yourself. The tributes that followed her death were extensive and genuine. The polio story was told again. Rome was revisited. The 3 gold medals were counted one more time. The integrated parade in Clarksville was mentioned in the way that details, which should not have been remarkable, are mentioned when the person they belong to is no longer there to point out the irony. What was mentioned less was the thing she had carried, The resentment that sat beneath the grace and the public dignity and the foundation work and the school visits. The feeling that the establishment had used one woman's legacy to diminish another's. That the comparison to Babe Didrikson had never been about athletic achievement and had always been about something the sport was not willing to examine directly. She never received a formal acknowledgement of it. No institution sat down and said plainly that what had been done with the comparison was unfair. No voice from the establishment that had constructed the hierarchy offered the correction she deserved. She carried it to the end, and the end came too early, and the carrying was never finished. Wilma Rudolph ran 3 races in Rome in 1960 and won all 3 of them. She did it on a leg that should not have existed in the condition it existed in, from a background that had provided every reason to stop before the starting line, in a country that had made clear it was not fully prepared to celebrate what she was about to do. She did it anyway. And the one thing she never forgave was the world's inability to simply let that be enough.